Putin and NATO don't agree on much these days, but there is one item where the two nuclear powers have had a strange meeting of the minds. The Russo-Ukraine war should be contained within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. That worked out well for everyone except Ukraine, who got the short end of the stick due to those restrictions. But the Ukrainians now have plans to get around this ban on attacking Russia and take the war further into the territory of their tormentor. What are these plans and how will Ukraine try to bypass the inhibitions of its allies when it comes to bringing the war into Russian territory? We'll get onto that and recent events related to the Wagner mutiny in a second, but first, let's talk about how Putin got it wrong from day one, genuinely thinking the Ukrainians would throw him a big welcome party when his soon-to-be wiped out by the dozens T-72, T-80 and T-90 main battle tanks came rolling into town. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, he believed that the war would last only for a matter of days. Kyiv and the hostile Zelensky government would fall, and he would be able to install a pro-Russian regime similar to the dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. Putin also believed that he would be welcomed with open arms by many people in Ukraine. Much of the population in that country speaks Russian and is ethnically Russian. The presence of these people in Crimea allowed him to easily take control over the peninsula in 2014, while installing puppet governments in the breakaway parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. That did not turn out to be the case in February 2022, and the war still rages. Ukraine surprised the world in its unity and effectiveness. It not only repelled most of Russia's initial assaults, but demonstrated an ability to reach targets far behind the lines and even into Russian territory. Whether it was the sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 or the mysterious explosion on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea 6 months later, Ukraine showed it could create real problems for Russia far away from the front. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, though, their means of doing so have been limited. Ukraine must maintain a constant flow of money and supplies from the West in order for it to continue its war effort, and the Western powers have had one goal from the beginning: keep the war confined to Ukraine's boundaries. Avoiding the escalation of this war into a great power conflict has been the overreaching aim even more than repelling Russian forces from Ukraine. This was the case as early as 2021, months before the invasion, when the United States Department of Defense came up with a basic plan to prevent the coming conflict in Ukraine from escalating into a broader war between NATO and Russia. Containing the hostilities within Ukraine's borders was the most important item in that plan. In keeping with this goal of keeping the war bottled up in Ukraine, the West has been reluctant to supply advanced, long-range weapons. NATO countries do not want Ukraine to be able to fight in Russia on a mass scale for fear of escalation. The Ukrainians have repeatedly requested advanced Western fighter jets like F-16s, for example, only to have been turned down many times. The United States has also turned down Ukraine's request for ATACMS. This weapon, short for the MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile System, a tactical ballistic missile with a range of up to 186 miles. ATACMS can be launched from HIMARS, a rocket artillery weapon the Ukrainians have proven devastatingly proficient in, and supplying them with ATACMS would make them only that much more effective. One of the official reasons given by Biden administration officials for denying Ukraine these missiles is that the United States has a supply shortage of them. In reality, the United States has been reluctant to provide ATACMS for fear that Ukraine would use these missiles to hit targets far deeper into Russia and raise the stakes of the conflict. Until the start of 2023, the West was also reluctant to provide advanced battle tanks to Ukraine for fear of escalation. In the first year of the war, the Ukrainians reluctantly respected the prohibition of their allies into taking the fight into Russian territory, but the situation is now starting to change. The Ukrainians have done the best they could with the conditions the West has given them, and in 2022, their best proved good indeed. However, Russia being able to operate with impunity behind its border has proven a big problem for Ukraine's war effort. For example, Russia has used bases in its territory to launch missile attacks against Ukrainian soldiers and cities. It has also, for the most part, used its territory to organize and supply its troops without fear that those supply lines would come under bombardment. From the West's perspective, this is an acceptable compromise, as there are fears that supplying Ukraine with longer-range weapons and moving the conflict into Russia's territory will gradually get NATO forces involved in the fighting and therefore escalate into World War III. Even if that scenario does not come to pass, there are also fears that putting Putin under even greater pressure will cause him to use tactical nuclear weapons as retaliation for strikes in Russia and as a ploy to turn the stagnant conflict in his favor. Blaming the West as the prime culprit that necessitated the use of such weapons would be likely. All of these conditions limit Ukraine's options for victory, but throughout the war, the Ukrainians have demonstrated ingenuity and daring, even despite the restrictions. If they could not take the war to Russian territory through conventional means, they have tried to do so through unconventional means. This capability is important because it may be more and more unlikely that the Ukrainians can end the conflict in a favorable way based on the means they currently have available. In early June 2023, Ukraine launched the counteroffensive that war watchers had been anticipating for months. But as the month wound down, it appeared that the operations were not proving as successful as hoped for. As of the end of June, Ukraine is gaining ground on all fronts it is attacking, but the pace is not matching the successes of 2022, and each attack depletes Ukraine's forces a little further, risking a culminating point far before they can accomplish their objectives. President Zelensky confirmed the disappointment when he stated that the counteroffensive has gone slower than desired, but he said he would not needlessly risk soldiers' lives to meet international expectations. So what's Ukraine doing elsewhere to make its war effort more effective? One way is to take the war inside of Russia on a grander scale. Zelensky had denied this in the middle of May, but in private, Ukraine's president has always been keen to take the fight into Russian territory. One of his ideas from early in the war, known from a leak of a top-secret trove of documents released on the social media app Discord, suggested raids into Russian territory to occupy lightly defended areas and keep them as leverage against the Russian forces in Ukraine. He also expressed concern that Ukraine does not have long-range missiles capable of reaching Russian troop deployments in Russia, nor anything with which to attack them. This is a deficiency he very much wants to reverse. In the leaked documents, Zelensky also floated the idea of using drone strikes to attack Russian targets in its Rostov Oblast. Zelensky officially denied all of these reports, but reiterated that Ukraine has the right to defend itself against its invaders using any means that it deems necessary. This declaration would include covert and asymmetrical means. Ukraine has deployed these methods frequently. In 2022 alone, there were 65 mysterious and destructive events across Russia. The incidents included fires and explosions on infrastructure used to support the Russian war effort, such as recruiting centers, trains transporting supplies to Russian forces, oil depots, government complexes, and the buildings of companies that manufacture military equipment, among other targets. There was also the unexplained explosion on the Kerch Bridge, connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland on October 9, 2022, which probably came by way of a Ukrainian drone or ship. Officially, Ukraine has had no involvement with such attacks. Unofficially, it is almost certain that Ukrainian intelligence assets were in on them. They were too well executed to be done amateurishly. None of the people involved in the incidents have ever been found by the Russian authorities. Ukraine has also launched limited drone and missile attacks on military bases in Russia. On December 6, 2022, a drone struck a Russian airbase near the city of Kursk, located about 90 miles from the border. The base's airfield went up in flames. An oil storage tank was also blown up. Ukraine denied responsibility for the attack but did celebrate it. No casualties were reported on the base. The attack on Kursk followed strikes on Engels Air Base, home to Russia's strategic bomber fleet, and one in Ryazan a few hours away from Moscow. Russia blamed Soviet-era drones as being the weapons involved in the attack. Ukraine did not claim responsibility for the strikes, but it was likely involved in the efforts. For its part, the United States publicly maintained that its policy was not to provide Ukraine with weapons that would allow strikes into Russian territory. Following the December 22 drone attacks, US State Department spokesman Ned Price said, "We are not enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We are not encouraging Ukraine to strike beyond its borders." Covert actions have not been limited to infrastructure. Mysterious attacks in Russian territory against pro-war Russian media figures have also taken place. Among the most well-known was a bombing in August 2022 which killed the daughter of Alexander Dugin, an ultra-nationalist Russian philosopher that Russia watchers sometimes call Putin's brain. Dugin himself was the real target of the attack, as he was the owner of the car that blew up. At the last minute that day, he decided to travel in another car instead. In April 2023, another vocal supporter of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the military blogger Vladlen Tatarsky, was killed in an attack at the St. Petersburg cafe he was eating in. A month later, Zakhar Prilepin, a staunchly pro-war Russian writer, was seriously injured in a car bombing about 265 miles east of Moscow. His driver was killed in the incident, and his car was turned on its head in the blast. Ukraine at first denied involvement in these attacks, but in a May 2023 interview, Major General Kirilo Budanov, the leader of Ukraine's military intelligence service, admitted that it had carried out targeted hits against people in Russia that were known as propagandists, saying, "We've already successfully targeted quite a few people. There have been well-publicized cases everyone knows about, thanks to the media coverage." It is possible that Budanov was lying in order to keep the Russians guessing, but the attacks were sophisticated and suggest that Ukraine's security services were involved in some way. They could have been directly involved in the attacks or worked with dissidents in Russia to carry them out. Unconventional methods of taking the war into Russian territory culminated in the Belgorod raid of May 2023. There, irregular forces comprised of Russian fighters who are aligned with Ukraine, the Freedom of Russia Legion, and the Russian Volunteer Corps easily swept past a border checkpoint and caused chaos in Russia's Belgorod Oblast for 2 days, occupying several lightly defended settlements just as Zelensky wished for in the leaked documents from over a year earlier. Western leaders did not raise a significant objection to this operation, which may pave the way for further operations inside of Russia. One of the official reasons given by the Freedom of Russia Legion and Russian Volunteer Corps for the Belgorod raid was to create a buffer zone that would ensure the safety of Ukrainian civilians. The territory that they raided and occupied for those days in May was often used as staging grounds for rocket and artillery attacks against Ukrainian population centers. Civilian casualties were high. Under this justification, many more areas in Russian territory could become targets for raids in the future, especially when considering how lightly defended the border checkpoints were. The weakness within Russia's borders and in the Putin regime revealed itself again toward the end of June when the Wagner Group, mercenaries who had borne the brunt of much of the fighting in Bakhmut and many other battles in Ukraine, mutinied. The mercenary group then moved towards Moscow in a march for justice. On the march, Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin seized control of military bases in Rostov-on-Don and possibly in Voronezh, a city 310 miles from Moscow. Prigozhin had been a long-time critic of Russia's war effort, and he has had a protracted feud with the Ministry of Defense and its leader Sergei Shoigu. As justification for his uprising, he claimed that his men had been killed in a number of airstrikes from the Russian military and now needed to see justice. Prigozhin demanded Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov to be handed over to him or he would march his column on Moscow. The Russian Ministry of Defense denied Prigozhin's claims and there is no evidence for them. The mutiny ended when Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko offered to house Prigozhin, a personal friend of his, in exile. Since Prigozhin is wanted internationally for war crimes, exile in Belarus was the best realistic deal for the Wagner boss, who Putin described as a backstabber. On the way out, Prigozhin ordered his men to stand down and return to their field camps to avoid bloodshed, leaving Rostov-on-Don. Although the Wagner Group's mutiny ended with a whimper after only 2 days, it was only the latest exposure of how vulnerable the Russian command and home front is to destabilization. The mutiny suggested that Putin's grip on power is not as tight as it was before the war. It's only natural that Ukraine would plan to use any means available to it to exploit this growing vulnerability. Sun Tzu said thousands of years ago, in his Art of War, that he could forecast victory or defeat based on which combatant had what he called the moral law on its side, which causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. Between Ukrainian unity and growing disunity in the Russian ruling elite, do not be surprised to see Ukraine trying to take further advantage of this ancient military maxim. If the Russian home front comes under greater stress, the likelihood of a withdrawal from Ukrainian territory, except perhaps Crimea, becomes more likely. Besides Sun Tzu's moral law, other reasons to attack Russian territory would be to force it to divert its troops away from the front, and therefore make Ukraine's chance of a successful counteroffensive in 2023 more likely. Attacks in Russian territory would also disrupt supply lines, communications, and command and control over troops on the front. For all of these reasons, it has become increasingly clear for Ukraine that allowing the war to take place solely on its territory is no longer an option. It must attack the territory of its invader. So far, the covert and irregular operations inside of Russia seem designed to test the limits of how much Western leaders will tolerate military action across the border. After the Belgorod raid, there has been a tacit understanding that similar raids are permissible in the future. There seems to be little objection to Russians fighting against Putin on Russian soil, although the Belgorod raids coming close to a Russian nuclear weapons base made a lot of people in the West nervous for understandable reasons. As the war continues to drag on, there may also be movement on giving Ukraine the longer-range weapons it needs to systematically strike targets inside of Russia. President Zelensky has recently claimed that Western fighter jets will be arriving. We will need to see how true that is. United States President Joe Biden may also be warming to the idea of loosening restrictions on providing Ukraine with the weapons it would need to strike targets deeper into Russian territory. For example, he recently declared that ATACMS might still be in play for Ukraine. Supplying Ukraine with ATACMS would put all of Crimea within range of HIMARS. It would also put Russian bases and critical supply lines deep in Russian territory within the range of Ukrainian retaliation. Supply depots, critical infrastructure, and troop concentrations in Russian territory would be far easier to target and disrupt with the use of ATACMS. As in most wars throughout history, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not going as either side expected. Vladimir Putin did not get the quick victory that either he or his opponents in the West imagined he would. Yet, for all its failures, the Russian army has proven resilient in the face of low morale and Ukrainian successes in 2022. If Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive is not as successful as its efforts last year, and the early effort does not look as promising as war watchers were hoping for, the Ukrainians will inevitably look for other ways to turn the war in their favor. Up until now, the interests of Ukraine and its Western backers were mostly aligned. But if the war continues to drag on in a World War I-style stalemate, there will be greater public pressure in NATO countries to not spend as much money supporting the Ukrainian war effort. Already in the United States, there is an influential minority on both the political left and right that have called the numerous aid packages coming from Washington into question. Recall that for the West, containing Putin's ambitions is ultimately more important than recovering every square inch of pre-2014 Ukrainian territory. For example, although France has maintained steady support for Ukraine, President Emmanuel Macron hinted at the possibility of negotiation early in 2023, when he said that the West's aim was to see Russia defeated but not crushed, with bringing Russia to the negotiating table as the end goal of further Western support, rather than booting its troops out of all the occupied territories. If more Ukrainian breakthroughs appear impossible, Western pressure on Kyiv to begin negotiations from a less favorable position than hoped would intensify, slowly but surely, as Ukraine's inability to make further gains through the force and strategy that it currently possesses becomes apparent. In the face of such pressure, Ukraine will try to further push the envelope in bringing operations to Russian soil. It will need some way to help make it more successful on the battlefield and ensure continued Western support, with the West still seeking Putin's defeat in Ukraine and signaling a greater tolerance for operations in Russian territory as the war goes on. Don't be surprised if taking the war across the border becomes an increasingly used tool in Ukraine's toolbox. If history teaches us anything, no war ever ends on the same conditions it begins with. Limiting the conflict to Ukraine's internationally recognized borders may have worked before, but as stalemate and depletion set in, there will soon come a time when the West will have to decide if its original plans to prevent the war from becoming a bigger one are still workable, or if that objective can still be achieved if Ukraine takes more overt and direct conventional action behind the Russian border. We will need to wait and see the level of risk the West is willing to tolerate under today's conditions in exchange for further containing Putin's expansionist ambitions. But what do you think? Are the West's original plans to prevent the conflict from escalating further still viable? Should Ukraine consider taking more direct action beyond the Russian border to prevent the war from escalating further? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.